Some men spend their lives running from ghosts. Callum Thorne stopped running 3 years ago. Now he just tracked stolen horses through territory where men vanished without a trace. But when he followed hoof prints into a canyon that seemed to swallow sound itself, he had no idea he was riding straight into a trap. A trap set by women who'd learned that mercy was more dangerous than any weapon. The arrow struck dirt inches from his boot. Callum didn't reach for his rifle. His hands went up slowly because he'd already counted them, dozens of women surrounding him with drawn weapons and eyes that promised death. But it wasn't anger in those eyes that made his blood run cold. It was purpose. Cold, calculated purpose that said they'd done this before. 3 days earlier, 4 of his horses had vanished from the southern pasture. Not stolen by amateurs, taken with precision that suggested someone who understood animals better than most men. The tracks led northwest, toward land everyone whispered about but nobody entered. Callum packed supplies for 2 days and followed anyway. Because what was waiting back home? An empty house. Silence. Memories that cut deeper than any blade. His wife Sarah, his daughter Emma, both dead 3 years now, burned alive while he checked fence lines in the far pasture. By the time he saw the smoke, the house was an inferno. He'd tried to break through. Neighbors had to drag him away as the structure collapsed. He pulled their bodies from ash the next morning and buried them where Sarah's flowers used to grow. After that, he'd become a man with nothing to lose, which made him exactly the kind of fool who'd ride alone into a canyon that swallowed men whole. The canyon walls closed in as he rode deeper. His horse grew skittish, ears flat, nostrils flaring at scents Callum couldn't detect. Then he saw it, a piece of fabric tied to a branch, placed exactly where someone on his path would notice. Not a warning, an invitation. The arrow came silent and deadly, but it wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to announce their presence. Women poured down from rocks and emerged from shadows with coordination that spoke of military precision. 20 of them, maybe more. They wore traditional dress modified for combat, leather and fabric that allowed movement. Some carried bows, others had blades. One held a rifle that looked ancient, but probably worked perfectly. Then their leader appeared. She moved through the others like a predator through tall grass, every warrior stepping aside without being asked. Tall, with dark hair braided tight against her skull and scars marking her arms and neck like a map of violence, survived. Her eyes saw through Callum's skin straight to whatever rotted underneath. When she spoke, her voice was cold as winter water. "You followed those horses a long way for a man who rides alone." Callum held her gaze. "They're mine. Everything here is ours." She tilted her head, and 2 women moved forward with rope. "You'll come with us. Fight, and you die here. Run, and you die tired. Cooperate, and you die tomorrow after we decide how." They bound his wrists with practiced efficiency, took his weapons, led his horse away separately, and Callum felt something close to regret watching his only companion disappear. The walk through hidden passages lasted hours. Time became elastic. No one spoke. They communicated through gestures and glances, a language built by people who'd learned words carried too far. When they emerged into open space, Callum understood why no one ever returned from this territory. The camp wasn't temporary shelters. It was a community, permanent structures, gardens in organized rows, children playing under watchful eyes, and every single person, warrior, elder, child, was female. Not one man, not anywhere. The implications crashed through Callum's mind. This wasn't coincidence. This was deliberate exile or revenge, or both. They tied him to a thick post in the camp center, arms pulled back at angles that would become agony long before morning. As the last knot tightened, Callum realized the most important truth about his situation. They'd been waiting. That fabric on the branch hadn't been invitation, it had been bait. And he'd followed it exactly as planned, Because men like him, men with nothing left to lose, were predictable in their recklessness. The leader crouched to meet his eyes at level. "My name is Kimala," she said quietly. "You'll stay here tonight. At dawn, we decide if you see another sunrise." She stood, then paused. "Those horses you followed? They weren't stolen. They were invited, just like you." She walked away, leaving Callum tied under a sky turning orange with sunset. And as darkness crept in, and cold seeped through his shirt and his shoulders began their inevitable ache, Callum realized something that should have terrified him, but instead felt almost like relief. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't alone with his ghosts. He was alone with theirs. But what Callum didn't know, what he couldn't possibly understand yet, was that Kimala had lied about one thing. The horses hadn't been invited. Only Callum had. And the reason why would change everything he thought he knew about survival, about loss, and about what it meant to be truly seen by someone who understood exactly what kind of scars never heal. Night brought cold that invaded his bones. The camp settled into quiet rhythms around him, fires banking low, voices fading, children herded inside with gentle firmness. Guards remained, 3 women rotating shifts, never leaving him unobserved. They checked his bonds every few hours with hands that pulled tight enough for security, but not cruelty. Around midnight, Kimala returned. She carried no visible weapon, though Callum suspected at least 2 blades hid somewhere on her body. She settled cross-legged facing him, expression unreadable in firelight that painted half her face in shadow. "Most men beg," she said without preamble, "or they threaten, or they try bargaining with things they imagine we want." Her eyes held his steadily. "You've done none of those things." Callum shifted, trying to ease pressure on his shoulders. Would any of it change what happens at dawn? No. Then why waste breath on useless words? Something flickered across her face, too quick to name. She leaned forward, studying him with renewed intensity. "You followed horses into territory everyone knows means death. Why?" The honest answer sat heavy in Callum's chest. He considered lying, considered silence, then decided truth from a man facing execution cost nothing. "Because I had nothing waiting back home worth protecting." Kimala's expression didn't change, but her stillness became different, more attentive. "The horses matter that little?" "The horses matter. But dying here or dying alone in an empty house 6 months from now amounts to the same destination." Callum met her eyes without flinching. "At least this way is quicker." She studied him for a long moment. Recognition flashed across her features. The look of someone who understood exactly what he meant because she'd felt that same weight herself. "What emptied your house?" Her voice had softened fractionally, barely noticeable, except Callum had spent 3 years listening for any human warmth in voices that mostly offered pity or avoidance. "Fire, 3 years back." The words came easier than expected. "My wife Sarah, my daughter Emma, they were inside when the kitchen hearth sparked wrong. I was in the far pasture checking fence lines. By the time I saw smoke and rode back, the whole structure was burning. I tried going in, but the heat pushed me back. Tried again and again until neighbors arrived and held me down while I watched it collapse." Kimala's face had gone very still. Behind her, other women had moved closer, drawn by voices in the quiet. They listened without pretense, without hiding their attention. "I pulled their bodies from ash the next morning," Callum continued, unable to stop now that he'd started. "Buried them where Sarah used to grow flowers, built markers with my own hands. Then I lived in that house alone for 6 months, before I couldn't anymore. Sold most of it. Kept the horses because they didn't remind me of what I'd lost. Just kept existing because stopping seemed harder than continuing." Silence stretched after his words, thick, heavy. One of the younger women, barely more than a girl, had tears tracking down her face. Even the guards had shifted closer, weapons lowered slightly. Kimela's voice carried new weight when she finally spoke. You understand what it means to lose everything to violence you couldn't stop. I understand. Callum held her gaze. I also understand that loss doesn't give anyone the right to inflict it on others. Those horses were taken, invited or not. I came to retrieve what was mine. If that earns execution, then execute. But don't pretend this is justice. It's just more loss, creating more loss. The words hung between them like a challenge. Kimela stood slowly, expression unreadable again. But something had shifted. Callum felt it in how the women watching didn't look away immediately, in how their postures had changed from hostile to something more complex. At dawn, Kimela said, turning away, we decide. But as she walked back toward the main fire, Callum noticed she didn't order the guards to tighten his bonds, didn't reinforce threats, just left him there with women who now watched him differently. Their expressions complicated by something he hadn't expected them to offer. Understanding. And maybe, despite everything, the first thread of unwilling respect, which made what happened next feel less like coincidence and more like a test he hadn't known he was taking. The howls started an hour before dawn, distant at first, then closer with the deliberate approach of predators who knew their prey couldn't escape. Callum's head jerked up from the half-sleep exhaustion had granted. Every instinct suddenly sharp and focused. He'd heard those sounds before. Wolves, a pack, and they were hunting. The camp exploded into motion. Women grabbed weapons and formed defensive positions with practiced speed, shouting orders while herding children toward central structures. Fires were built higher, creating walls of light that should deter the animals. Should being the critical word everyone present understood. Callum yanked against his bonds hard enough to feel rope burn skin. They're circling from the east side. Your fire line has a gap near the supply tent. Kimela spun toward him, bow already drawn. How do you know? Because that's where your scent trails are weakest and the shadows run deepest. That's where I'd attack if I were them. Callum pulled harder, feeling wood creak. You need to close that gap now or they'll punch through and get to the children. For a heartbeat, Kimela hesitated. Then she barked orders, and 3 warriors sprinted toward the eastern perimeter, taking positions exactly where Callum had indicated. Just in time, gray shapes materialized from darkness, eyes reflecting firelight as at least 8 wolves tested the defenses, with intelligence that said they'd learned humans protected the weak predictably. The youngest warrior, the girl Callum had noticed crying earlier, held position near the supply area with a spear that trembled in her grip. She couldn't have been more than 16. Fear written clearly across her face despite the brave stance. When the largest wolf feinted left, then charged right, she stumbled backward. The spear dropped as she fell. Callum didn't think, didn't calculate. He threw his full weight against the post with everything he had, feeling old wood crack and shift. The rope holding his wrists dug in until warm blood ran down his forearms. But he kept pulling, kept forcing, muscles screaming as he tried to break bonds tied by people who knew their craft. Takakota, roll left. He roared the warning as the wolf closed distance. Somehow, the girl heard him through her panic and obeyed, tumbling sideways just as massive jaws snapped closed where her throat had been. An arrow took the wolf mid-leap. Ayasha's shot, clean and lethal. But 2 more animals broke through the gap, heading straight for the structures where children huddled. Callum pulled harder against the post, feeling it crack further, feeling rope slice deeper. Not caring about pain because that girl was scrambling backward on the ground and another wolf had circled behind her position. Cut him loose. Kimela's voice cut through chaos like a blade. Sharp and absolute. But he'll run, one of the guards protested. He would have already shouted for them to attack our weak points if he wanted us destroyed. Kimela drew her bow back, eyes never leaving the advancing wolves. Cut him loose now. The knife sliced through rope. Callum's arms dropped forward, shoulders exploding with pain from hours of unnatural position. He had maybe 3 seconds before circulation returned enough for control. He used them to grab the fallen spear near his feet and lunge toward Takakota, planting himself between her and the circling wolf with a weapon he could barely grip properly. The animal charged. Callum set the spear butt against ground and angled the point up, every movement familiar from years of defending livestock. The wolf impaled itself, trying to reach him, weight and momentum driving the point deep. It died with a yelp that sent the rest of the pack scattering backward, reassessing prey that had suddenly become dangerous. Callum stayed standing between Takakota and darkness until the wolves finally retreated into pre-dawn shadows, until Kimala called cease and warriors lowered weapons with the careful relief of people who'd survived, but knew how close it had been. Only then did Callum allow himself to drop to one knee, breathing hard, watching blood drip from his wrists onto earth that had already seen too much of it. Around him, women stared with expressions he couldn't quite read. Not gratitude exactly, something more complicated. Takakota stood slowly, retrieved her spear, then did something that made the entire camp go silent. She placed her hand on Callum's shoulder, squeezed once with firm acknowledgement, and spoke words he didn't need translated to understand. "Thank you. You didn't have to, but you did." Kimala approached as dawn finally broke over the canyon walls, painting everything in shades of gold and red. She extended her hand to help Callum stand, the first time she'd offered anything resembling assistance. "You could have run," she said quietly. "You were free. You had weapons. You could have disappeared into darkness while we fought." Callum met her eyes steadily, too exhausted for anything but truth. "Where exactly would I run to that matters more than here?" Something shifted in Kimala's expression, a wall cracking that might never fully repair itself. She held his gaze for a long moment, then turned to face her warriors. "He stays untied. We'll discuss what that means after we tend wounds and secure the perimeter." She looked back at Callum with an expression that held weariness, but also acknowledgement. "You've earned this much, at least. Don't make me regret it." But as she walked away to organize recovery, Callum noticed how every woman he passed looked at him differently now, not as a prisoner awaiting execution, as something else entirely, something they hadn't expected to find bound to a post in their camp. A man who'd chosen protecting them over saving himself, and in doing so had begun rewriting every assumption they'd built about men like him. The healer, Nasha, cleaned Callum's wrists with practiced efficiency. She worked in silence near the morning fire, applying salve that stung briefly before numbing the pain. Around them, the camp resumed normal rhythms, women repairing damage from the wolf attack while keeping careful watch on the outsider who'd earned temporary reprieve but not yet trust. When Nasha finished wrapping clean fabric around both wrists, she finally met his eyes with curiosity more than hostility. "You could have let Takakota face her consequence," Nasha said softly. "Most men would have used chaos as opportunity for escape. Most men haven't spent 3 years understanding that running from one place just means arriving somewhere else equally empty." Nasha studied him with the intensity of someone trained to see beyond surfaces. She nodded once, almost to herself, then gathered her supplies and left. But Callum noticed how she paused near Kimala, spoke quietly, gestured toward him with movements that suggested recommendation rather than warning. Throughout the morning, Callum remained where Kimala had indicated, a spot near the eastern edge that offered view of the entire camp but remained separate from main activity. Women passed regularly, some glancing his direction with expressions ranging from suspicion to something approaching gratitude. Children peered at him from behind their mothers, fascinated by this strange man who'd appeared in their exclusively female world. When the sun reached its highest point, Ayasha approached with purpose in her stride. She carried rope and a heavy bundle of cut wood, dropping both at Callum's feet without ceremony. "The corral fence needs repair from where the wolves tested it. You know how to work with your hands?" Callum looked at the materials, then at her face, reading the test clearly. "I do." "Then prove your keep or prove Kimala wrong for letting you live." Ayasha turned away, then paused. "No one watches you now. Eastern Trail leads out of the canyon. We both know you could follow it." "I could." Callum stood slowly, gathering wood and rope. "Won't, though." "Why not?" The answer came easier than it should have. "Because for the first time in 3 years, I'm somewhere that people needed me to stay alive. That matters more than freedom." Something shifted in Ayasha's expression, a crack in her hardness that let through brief warmth. She nodded curtly and walked away. But Callum noticed she didn't assign anyone to guard him. The message was clear. He could leave. They wouldn't stop him. But staying meant something different than captivity now. He spent hours repairing the fence, using skills learned from years of ranch work. Other women worked nearby, occasionally glancing his direction to assess progress. No one spoke to him directly, but their presence felt less like surveillance and more like gradual acceptance. By late afternoon, when he'd finished the repair and begun working on a second section, Takakota approached. She moved with the uncertainty of youth trying to appear brave, stopping a careful distance away. "My mother says I should thank you properly." Her voice carried the slight tremor of someone forcing courage. "For saving my life." Callum set down his tools and faced her fully. "You don't owe me thanks for doing what any decent person would do. But you weren't any person. You were a prisoner who'd been told he would die at dawn." Takakota stepped closer, her mother watching from across camp with protective alertness. "You could have let me face the wolf, could have used the distraction to escape. Instead, you nearly broke your own wrists trying to reach me." "Your life mattered more than my freedom." The words came simply, carrying truth that needed no embellishment. Takakota's eyes filled with tears. She blinked away quickly. She stepped forward and placed something in Callum's palm, a small carved figure, rough but recognizable as a horse, made from wood worn smooth by handling. "My father made this before he—" She didn't finish, didn't need to. "I want you to have it, as reminder that some men can still be worth knowing." She left before Callum could respond, running back toward her mother who wrapped an arm around her shoulders while watching Callum with less hostility than that morning. He looked down at the carved horse in his palm, feeling weight that had nothing to do with wood and everything to do with meaning. When Kimala found him as evening approached, he was still holding it. "The council has deliberated," she said without preamble. "You've earned the right to stay as long as you prove useful and respectful." She paused, measuring him. "But tonight, you face one final test, one that will determine whether you truly understand what it means to exist among us without bringing the violence most men carry in their bones." Callum closed his fingers around the carved horse. "What test?" Kimala's expression remained unreadable. "You'll see after dark. Be ready." She walked away, leaving Callum with sunset painting the canyon walls in amber and red, holding a child's carved horse and wondering what final test awaited that would decide if he'd truly found something worth staying for. They came for him after the moon rose. A dozen women moving through shadows with purpose that made Callum's pulse quicken despite his determination to remain calm. Kimala led them, expression unreadable in firelight that painted faces in copper and darkness. They formed a circle around him where he stood near the corral, close enough that he could smell sage smoke on their clothing and feel the heat of their bodies. No one spoke. No one explained. They simply watched with eyes that held questions he couldn't yet understand. Kimala stepped forward, and the others tightened their circle until Callum stood surrounded by women whose proximity felt deliberate, a test with meaning beyond simple observation. His instinct screamed to step back, to demand space, to assert the boundary most men would defend without thinking. Instead, he forced himself to remain still, to breathe evenly, to let them control the moment without resistance. "You've proven you can protect," Kimala said quietly. "Now prove you can submit." The word hung in the air like smoke, complex and dangerous. Callum met her eyes, reading the challenge clearly. This wasn't about physical submission. This was about whether he could exist among them without needing to dominate, without requiring control, without letting his presence become threat through proximity and strength. Ayasha moved first, stepping close enough that Callum could feel warmth radiating from her skin. She placed one hand on his shoulder, firm but not aggressive, measuring muscle and tension beneath her palm. Her eyes never left his face, watching for reaction, for the flash of anger or desire that would prove him like other men they'd known. Callum held perfectly still, letting her touch exist without responding to it, without interpreting it as invitation or insult, just accepting that she needed to test him this way, needed to know if closeness triggered violence or demand. Nasha approached next, placing her hand over his heart, feeling the rapid beat beneath his ribs that he couldn't control, even if he controlled everything else. Her expression softened slightly as she felt his pulse, recognizing fear being mastered rather than absence of it. "He's terrified," she murmured to Kimala, "but not of us, of failing whatever this is." Others moved closer then, hands touching his arms, his back, his face with curiosity that held no seduction but rather assessment. They were learning him through touch the way they might learn a horse, checking for hidden wounds, for places where pressure created resistance or rage, testing if he would grab, would push, would use superior strength to reclaim control of his own body. Callum closed his eyes, not in avoidance, but in acceptance, letting himself be vulnerable in a way he hadn't allowed since Sarah died, letting women he barely knew touch him with hands that mapped scars and tension while he stood undefended and chose trust over self-preservation. Takakoda knelt before him, looking up with tears streaming down her face. "No man has ever stood like this among us. They all fought. All of them." "I'm not fighting," Callum whispered, voice rough with emotion he couldn't entirely suppress. "I'm surrendering to being seen." The words created stillness so complete that even breathing seemed loud. Kimala moved closer until she stood directly in front of him, her face inches from his own. She placed both hands on either side of his face, tilting it down so he met her eyes at close range. "Why?" The single word carried weight of every loss she'd suffered, every betrayal she'd witnessed, every reason she'd built this refuge away from men who'd proven themselves monsters through violence and violation. Because being alone forever is worse than risking being hurt again. Callum held her gaze despite tears burning behind his eyes. "Because you've all lost something, and I've lost everything, and maybe broken people can exist together without breaking each other further." Kimala's hands trembled against his face, the first crack in her armor that Callum had witnessed. Around them, women who'd watched with suspicion now looked at him with something approaching wonder. Not because he'd proven strong, because he'd proven capable of weakness without shame. "What was her name?" Kimala asked softly. "Your wife." "Sarah. And my daughter was Emma. They died because I wasn't there to save them. My husband was called Nahuel. My sons were Kichi and Alo." Kimala's voice fractured on the names. "They died because I was there but couldn't stop the violence." Behind her, other women murmured names of their own dead with voices that carried 3 years of grief. They began to kneel one by one until Callum stood at the center of a circle of kneeling women who looked up at him not with worship but with recognition. He was their grief reflected back in male form. He was proof that loss didn't belong exclusively to their gender. When Kimala finally released his face and stepped back, her expression had transformed completely. You've passed the test, but you've done something more dangerous than that. Callum's breath caught. What? You've made us remember that before we were warriors, we were human, and humans who've lost everything either harden into stone or learn to hold tenderness carefully in scarred hands. She glanced around at her women, seeing them differently than before. You've shown us which choice you've made. Now we have to decide if we're brave enough to make it too. But even as relief flooded through Callum, even as women began to stand and disperse with expressions softer than when they'd arrived, he couldn't shake the feeling that passing this test meant he'd committed to something far more complicated than simple survival. Days became a rhythm Callum hadn't known he'd been craving. He woke with the camp at dawn, worked alongside women who gradually stopped watching his every movement with suspicion, shared meals around fires where conversation flowed in mixtures of their language and his until understanding happened through gesture as much as words. He taught them techniques for preserving meat, how to reinforce structures against weather, methods for training horses that relied on patience rather than force. They taught him their ways of reading land, of moving through territory without leaving traces, of understanding wind and sky with attention he'd forgotten men could possess. 3 weeks after the night of testing, Kimala found him near the horse corral where he'd been working with a young mare skittish from past trauma. He'd spent hours simply existing in her space, letting her approach on her terms, showing that proximity didn't automatically mean pain. The mare had finally allowed him to touch her neck that morning, trembling but trusting, and the small victory felt more significant than anything he'd accomplished in years. You have a gift with broken things, Kimala observed, leaning against the fence, making them believe healing is possible. Callum stroked the mare's neck with careful gentleness. I understand what it feels like to be convinced you're too damaged for anything good again. Is that why you stayed? To heal? Maybe. He moved closer, and the mare didn't shy away despite another person's presence, testament to how calm Callum kept his energy. Or maybe I stayed because leaving would mean going back to being alone with ghosts that don't speak. He met Kimala's eyes. Here at least the ghosts are shared. She was quiet for a long moment, watching him work with the horse, her expression carrying weight of someone deciding whether to trust words that lived too painful to speak aloud. Finally, she drew breath and began. 4 years ago, this canyon held both men and women. We lived as families, raised children together, existed in balance that felt permanent. Her voice remained steady through visible effort. Then settlers came claiming land they said belonged to them through papers we couldn't read and laws we never agreed to follow. When we refused to leave, they returned with more men and weapons. Callum's hands stilled on the mare's neck. He didn't turn, didn't interrupt, just listened with complete attention. They attacked at dawn, burned our structures. My husband Nahuel tried to defend our sons. He died with arrows in his back while Kitchi and Alo ran toward me screaming. Her voice fractured slightly. I reached them. I was holding them both when the bullets came. I felt their bodies jerk, felt their blood soak into my dress, watched light leave their eyes while I knelt in dirt that turned to mud from what spilled out of them. Callum closed his eyes against the image, against the echo of his own memories of bodies pulled from ash. 70 people lived here before that morning. 19 women survived. No men, no boys over 12. Kimala's hands gripped the fence hard enough that her knuckles whitened. We buried everyone in the canyon's far end. Then we made a choice. No more men. No more trusting that violence wouldn't follow them into our home. We would survive alone, raise daughters alone, exist without ever again believing that safety could include male presence. Until I arrived, Callum said quietly. Until you arrived and proved you could stand among us without bringing the violence we'd learned to expect. She turned to face him fully. You're the first man we've allowed to live here in 4 years. The first one who didn't immediately try to take, to control, to assert dominance through force or threat. That evening, the women gathered around the central fire and sang mourning songs that carried names of the dead into darkness. Callum sat at the circle's edge, listening to loss given voice through melody that needed no translation. When they sang for children taken too soon, his throat tightened with emotion. He'd kept locked behind walls built from survival and shame. Nasha noticed. She moved to sit beside him, placing her hand over his with quiet understanding. You're allowed to grieve here. We all do. The permission broke something inside Callum that he'd held rigid for 3 years. Tears came silently at first, then with shaking he couldn't control. Grief finally finding release among people who understood exactly what it meant to lose everything and still somehow continue breathing. Kimila's voice rose above others, singing a name that must have been her husband's. And Callum added his voice to hers, speaking Sarah and Emma's names into night air for the first time since their burial. Around him, women joined the speaking of names, creating a chorus of loss, acknowledged and witnessed. When the songs ended and silence settled heavy with catharsis, Takakota approached with her mother Ayasha behind her. The older warrior placed her hand on Callum's shoulder with firmness that carried meaning. "You are no longer outsider here," Ayasha said, her voice carrying authority. "You are brother to us now, family earned through choice rather than blood." But even as warmth flooded through Callum, acceptance he'd stopped believing he deserved, hoofbeats echoed from the canyon entrance. Distant, but approaching. Multiple horses moving with purpose, and everything they'd carefully built was about to face its first real test. The camp transformed instantly. Women grabbed weapons and herded children toward protected areas with practiced efficiency. Kimila issued orders in their language, sharp and clear, while warriors took defensive positions along the canyon's natural choke points. Within moments, the settlement looked empty, except for guards hidden in shadows with arrows nocked and ready. Callum moved toward the perimeter without thinking, instinct driving him toward threat rather than away. Ayasha caught his arm, her grip iron strong. "You stay hidden. If they see you here, they'll know we harbor outsiders. They'll use it as excuse for violence." "How many times have they come before?" "Twice. Both times demanding we leave, claiming this land belongs to settlers now." Kimila appeared beside them, bow in hand, expression carved from stone. "Both times we've held them off through superior position and their reluctance to die for someone else's claim, but each time they return with more men and less patience." The riders emerged into view. 7 men armed with rifles and revolvers, led by someone wearing a marshal's badge that caught sunlight with authority meant to intimidate. They stopped 50 feet from the nearest structure, scanning the apparently empty camp with expressions ranging from suspicion to outright hostility. "We know you're here," the marshal called out. "We're looking for a man, Callum Thorne. White, tall, likely on foot or horseback. His animals were found abandoned near your territory 3 weeks back. You know anything about that?" Silence answered him. The marshal shifted in his saddle, hand resting casually on his weapon. "We can do this easy or hard. Easy as you tell us what you know and we ride out peaceful. Hard as we search every structure until we find answers. Your choice." Callum felt every muscle in his body tense with decision warring against itself. He could step out, end this confrontation before it escalated, protect these women from violence he'd inadvertently brought to their refuge. Or he could stay hidden, trust them to handle threat they'd faced before. Except sometimes protection meant allowing others to defend what they'd built. Before he could choose, Kimila stepped into view with 3 warriors flanking her. They moved with confidence that came from knowing terrain and having nothing left to lose. "This is our land," Kimila stated flatly. "Recognized by treaty your people signed and broke. No man has entered our canyon in 4 years. If his animals were found nearby, Perhaps he met the same end that awaits anyone who trespasses where they're not welcome. The marshal's eyes narrowed. That sounds like a threat. That sounds like information. Kimala didn't blink, didn't shift her stance. You've gotten your answer. Now leave before you discover how seriously we take our boundaries. Tension stretched tight as bowstring, the kind of moment where single wrong word could ignite violence nobody present would survive unchanged. Callum saw the marshal calculating odds, weighing pride against potential casualties, recognizing that women defending home territory with superior position weren't prey to be easily taken. Callum made his choice. He stepped from hiding, hands visible and empty, walking toward the confrontation with steady purpose that made both sides react with surprise. Ayasha hissed his name in warning, but he kept moving until he stood beside Kimala, positioning himself deliberately between the marshal and the woman who'd offered him sanctuary. I'm Callum Thorne, he said clearly. I came here tracking horses, got caught in a storm, took shelter, waited it out. The lie came smooth as truth, protecting their secret with story that covered reality. These women showed hospitality when they could have shown hostility. I'm leaving now on my own terms, causing no trouble. He started walking toward the riders, each step taking him away from the only place he'd felt human in 3 years. But before he'd made it halfway, Kimala's voice stopped him cold. No. The single word carried such absolute authority that even the marshal's horse shifted nervously. Kimala moved to stand beside Callum. Then Ayasha joined them, then Nasha, then Takakota, until every warrior in the camp formed a line between him and the men who'd come searching. He stays, Kimala stated, under our protection, by our choice. If you have issue with that, you're welcome to try removing him. Her smile held no warmth, only promise of cost. But I guarantee you won't all ride away to try. The marshal studied the line of women, studied Callum's face for signs of coercion, and found none. Studied the defensive positions he could now see hidden in rocks and shadows. His calculation shifted visibly. Whatever he'd expected to find, it wasn't a man protected by warriors willing to die for his right to stay. You're choosing them over your own people? The marshal directed his question at Callum with disgust clear in his tone. Callum met his eyes steadily. I'm choosing family over strangers who show up making demands on land they have no right to claim. The words hung in air thick with implication. The marshal's jaw tightened, but he was smart enough to recognize when odds had shifted against him. He wheeled his horse around with movement sharp as anger. This isn't finished, he called back. We'll return with more men. They rode away, dust rising behind them, threat trailing in their wake. When hoofbeats finally faded, Ayasha turned to Callum with expression mixing fury and something approaching pride. You fool. You could have left safely. I could have, Callum agreed, but then I wouldn't be family anymore. And in that moment, with women surrounding him who'd risked themselves to defend his right to stay, Callum understood he hadn't just found refuge, he'd found home. But what none of them knew, what they couldn't possibly see coming, was that the marshal's return would bring more than just men with weapons. It would bring a choice that would test everything they'd built together, a choice between survival and principle, between safety and what it truly meant to be family. And the decision would change not just Callum's fate, but the fate of every woman and child in the canyon. 3 months passed without the marshal's return, though everyone knew the threat lingered like storm clouds on distant horizons. Callum stopped wondering when they'd come back and started focusing on what he could build in whatever time remained. He worked alongside the women with hands that had forgotten what purpose felt like until now, repairing structures, teaching skills, learning their ways of reading land and sky with attention that made survival feel less like burden and more like art. But it was the small moments that revealed how completely he'd been woven into the fabric of their community. Takakota sought him out each evening to practice horse training techniques, her confidence growing with each animal that learned to trust her gentle approach. She looked at him the way she might have looked at a father, with admiration uncomplicated by fear or disappointment. Nasha brought him tea made from herbs she gathered, always appearing when his shoulders tensed from old injuries or his expression went distant with memories. She saw him as healer recognizes healer, someone who understood that some wounds required time and patience more than medicine could provide. Ayasha trained with him in combat techniques, testing his skills while teaching him their methods. She'd stopped viewing him as potential threat and started seeing him as warrior worthy of respect, calling him brother with pride that made the word mean everything. The other women had each found their own relationship with him. Some valued his strength for heavy labor. Others appreciated his patience with children who'd never known male presence without violence attached. Some simply enjoyed his quiet company during evening fires, the way he listened more than spoke, the way his presence had become familiar rather than foreign. But it was Kimala whose regard mattered most, and whose regard had shifted in ways neither of them fully acknowledged aloud. She sought him out at dawn and dusk, times when the camp lay quiet and conversation could happen without audience. They spoke of loss and survival, of the weight of leading people who'd suffered more than anyone should bear, of the exhaustion that came from remaining strong when all you wanted was permission to crumble. One evening, as sunset painted the canyon walls in copper and gold, Kimala found him working on the corral fence, where the mare he'd gentled now stood calm and trusting. She watched him for a long moment before speaking. You could leave now. The trail east would take you back to settled territory. You could reclaim whatever life you left behind. Callum set down his tools and turned to face her fully. What life? Empty house, silent days, existing without purpose or connection. He shook his head slowly. I'd rather face whatever threat that marshal brings than return to that. Even knowing we can't promise safety, that violence might find us again? Especially knowing that. Callum stepped closer, close enough to see firelight reflected in her eyes. Because facing danger alongside people who matter is better than safety that feels like slow burial. Kimala held his gaze with intensity that made breathing difficult. You've changed us. We were surviving. Now we're living again. You reminded us that not all men carry violence in their bones, that some carry grief that's made them gentle instead of hard. You changed me too. Callum's voice roughened with emotion. I came here ready to die. You gave me reason to live. She reached out and took his hand, lacing their fingers together with deliberateness that spoke of decision made carefully. Around them, women who'd been watching from discreet distances smiled with understanding that needed no words. They'd all seen this building between their leader and the man who'd proven himself worthy through vulnerability rather than force. Then stay, Kimala said simply. Not as guest or temporary presence. Stay as one of us, as family, as whatever we become to each other in time. Callum looked around the camp that had transformed from prison to refuge to home. He saw Takakota waving from near the horses, Nasha tending herbs with peaceful focus, Ayasha sharpening weapons while humming songs he now recognized. He saw women who'd been broken by violence learning to trust again. Children growing up knowing that male presence didn't automatically mean danger. A community rebuilding itself with stronger foundations than before. He'd won more than their hearts. He'd won his own back from the ashes of a fire that had taken everything, and in doing so, he'd shown them that healing was possible even for damage that seemed permanent. I'll stay, he said, and felt the words settle into his bones like truth he'd been searching for without knowing the shape of what he sought. For as long as you'll have me. Kimala smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her, and suddenly, Callum understood what Sarah would have wanted for him. Not eternal mourning, not isolated existence, but this, new purpose, new family, New chance at life built on foundation of loss transformed into wisdom. That night around the fire with women who'd become his family, Callum laughed at a story Takakota told with animated gestures. The sound felt foreign in his throat, rusty from disuse, but genuine in a way nothing had been for 3 years. And when Kimala's hand found his in the darkness, fingers intertwining with easy familiarity, Callum finally understood what it meant to be home. But just as he began to believe that peace might actually last, just as he dared to imagine a future beyond survival, the hoofbeats returned. This time they weren't distant. They were close, dozens of them. And the dust cloud rising from the canyon entrance wasn't from 7 men. It was from an army. The marshal had kept his promise. He'd returned with more men. And this time, they weren't coming to talk. The camp erupted into controlled chaos. Women moved with the precision of dancers executing choreography they'd rehearsed, knowing this moment would come. Children vanished into hidden spaces. Warriors took positions that turned the canyon into a killing ground. Fires were doused to eliminate silhouettes. Every advantage of terrain and preparation was activated in under 2 minutes. Callum stood at the canyon's narrowest point, beside Kimala and Ayasha, watching the dust cloud approach. His hands were steady despite his racing heart. For the first time in 3 years, he had something worth fighting for, something worth dying for. And the clarity of that purpose felt almost like peace. 30 men, Kimala said quietly, counting the shapes emerging from dust. Maybe more. All armed. All willing. We've held this canyon against worse odds, Ayasha stated, though her voice carried doubt she tried to hide. Not against this many, not with this much motivation. Kimala's fingers tightened on her bow. They're not here to negotiate anymore. They're here to end us. Callum saw it clearly, the marshal at the front, flanked by men whose expressions promised violence. Behind them, more riders. And behind those, wagons. Supply wagons. They'd come prepared for siege, for sustained assault, for whatever it took to claim this land and remove the women who'd dared to defend it. There's still the Eastern Trail, Callum said quietly. You could evacuate the children. Get them out before... Before what? Kimala cut him off. Before we lose the only home we have left? Before we surrender the one place we've managed to exist without fear? She shook her head firmly. We don't run. We've run enough. The riders stopped at the canyon entrance, just out of effective arrow range. Smart. Cautious. They'd learned from their last encounter. The marshal dismounted, flanked by 2 men who carried rifles like extensions of their bodies. Professional fighters, not settlers or drifters, men hired to do a job. Kimala! The marshal's voice echoed off canyon walls. We're giving you one chance. You and your women vacate this canyon by sunset tomorrow. Take your children and leave. There's land to the north where your people can relocate. Treaties can be renegotiated. Treaties your people broke, Kimala shouted back. Land you stole after promising peace. That's history, the marshal replied. This is now, and right now, you're squatting on claimed land. Leave peacefully or be removed by force. Your choice. Silence stretched between the 2 positions. Callum saw women along the canyon walls, hidden but ready. He saw Takakota crouched behind rocks, spear in hand, trying to look brave while fear danced behind her eyes. He saw Nasha positioning herself near the children's hiding place, prepared to be last line of defense if everything else failed. We're not leaving, Kimala stated, each word carved from stone. This canyon is ours by right of blood and treaty. You want it? Come take it. But know that every inch you advance will cost you men, and when you finally reach our position, if you reach it, you'll find women who've already lost everything. Women with nothing left to fear. Women who'll make you pay for every step with blood you didn't know you had. The threat hung in the air like smoke. The marshal studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, almost sadly. So be it. We'll give you until dawn tomorrow. After that, We're coming through. And we won't stop until this canyon is empty or you're all dead." He mounted his horse and the riders pulled back, disappearing beyond the canyon entrance to make camp. They were professional enough to know that attacking exhausted defenders at dawn was smarter than assaulting prepared positions in daylight. When they'd gone, Kimala turned to her warriors. Her expression carried weight that made Callum's chest tighten. "They'll come at first light. They'll use numbers and firepower to overwhelm us. We can hold for a time, but not forever." She paused, meeting each woman's eyes. "Anyone who wants to take the Eastern Trail with the children, I won't judge. This is a fight we might not survive." Not one woman moved. Not one voice spoke agreement. They stood unified in silence that said more than words ever could. Ayasha stepped forward. "We've survived everything together. If we fall together." Nasha joined her. "Our families died in this canyon. If we must die too, at least we die protecting what they gave their lives for." Takakota raised her spear. "I've never known safety outside these walls. I won't abandon them now." One by one, every warrior made their stance clear. They would fight. They would hold. They would make the cost so high that whoever claimed this canyon afterward would remember the price for generations. Callum felt something shift inside his chest, pride and grief and determination mixing into emotion he couldn't name. These women had taught him what courage truly meant. Not absence of fear, but choosing to stand despite terror screaming to run. As darkness fell and the camp prepared for what might be their final night, Callum found himself alone with Kimala near the horse corral. The animals sensed tension, restless and nervous. Callum stroked the mare he'd gentled, feeling her tremble beneath his palm. "You should take the children and go," he said quietly. "I'll stay. Hold the canyon as long as possible. Give you time to reach safety." Kimala laughed, a sound with no humor. "You think you can hold 30 men alone?" "I think I can hold them long enough." "For what? So we can scatter into territory that's just as dangerous? So we can spend the rest of our lives running again?" She turned to face him, firelight painting her features in shades of determination and defiance. "No. We stand together, or we don't stand at all. Then we're all going to die." "Maybe." Kimala moved closer, taking his hands in hers. "But at least we'll die as we've lived these past months, as family, as people who chose each other when we had every reason to choose isolation." She kissed him then, not desperately but deliberately, with intention that said this wasn't about fear of death but affirmation of life. When she pulled back, her eyes held tears she refused to let fall. "Thank you," she whispered, "for reminding us what it means to trust, to hope, to believe that not all men carry violence in their bones." Callum wanted to tell her that hope wasn't gone, that they'd find a way to survive this. But lies served no purpose when dawn would bring truth written in blood and gunpowder. So instead, he held her close, memorizing the warmth of her body against his, storing the feeling for whatever came next. Around them, the camp settled into tense quiet. Women checking weapons, whispering prayers to ancestors, holding children who sensed danger even if they didn't understand its shape. Everyone preparing for battle they knew they couldn't win but refused to surrender without fighting. And Callum, standing in a canyon that had become his home among women who'd become his family, made a decision. If dawn would bring death, then he'd make damn sure it brought something else first. He'd make sure it brought a miracle. Callum left the camp 2 hours before dawn. He moved through darkness with skills learned from years tracking animals and 3 months learning from women who could disappear into landscape like ghosts. No one saw him leave. No one questioned his absence. They were too focused on defensive preparations to notice one man slipping through shadows toward the canyon entrance, toward the marshal's camp. He'd spent the night forming a plan so desperate it bordered on insane. but desperation was all he had left. Desperation and knowledge of men like the Marshal, men who valued profit over principle, who'd do violence for money but who'd also accept better offers if they appeared. The Marshal's camp sprawled across open ground beyond the canyon entrance. 30-some men sleeping around banked fires, guards rotating in predictable patterns. Professional operation, disciplined, but also bored. These weren't men fighting for homeland or honor. They were hired guns doing a job they'd been paid to complete, which meant they could be persuaded to accept different payment. Callum circled wide, approaching from the east where shadows ran deepest. He waited until a guard passed, then moved forward with steps that made no sound. He was 10 feet from the Marshal's tent when a voice stopped him cold. "That's far enough." Callum froze, raised his hands slowly. A man emerged from shadows with rifle pointed at Callum's chest, finger on trigger. But instead of shooting or raising alarm, the guard studied Callum with curious expression. "You're the one they're protecting," the guard said quietly. "The one who chose them over your own kind." "They are my kind," Callum replied evenly. "More than men who murder women and children for land claims." The guard's expression shifted, something crossing his features that looked almost like shame. "It's just a job, nothing personal." "Everything's personal when children die for it." Silence stretched between them. The guard's rifle wavered slightly, decision warring behind his eyes. Then he lowered the weapon with movement that suggested relief. "Marshal's tent. Straight ahead. If he shoots you, I didn't see nothing." The guard melted back into shadows, leaving Callum standing alone with racing heart and slim hope that maybe not all men hired for violence were beyond reaching. Callum approached the Marshal's tent, announced his presence before entering because surprising armed men rarely ended well. When he ducked inside, he found the Marshal sitting up on his bedroll, revolver already drawn and pointed with practiced ease. "Bold move walking into enemy camp alone," the Marshal said. "Stupid, but bold. I came to make a deal. We don't deal with squatters. You deal with anyone who can make your job easier and more profitable." Callum stepped further inside, hands still visible. "Those women have nothing you want except land, but I have something better." The Marshal's eyes narrowed with interest, despite himself. "I'm listening." "Information about gold deposits in the northern ranges, deposits that make this canyon look worthless by comparison." The lie came smooth, built on truth he knew about mining operations he'd passed during his tracking days. "Let them keep this canyon, and I'll show you where real wealth waits, enough to make you richer than any land claim ever could." "Why should I believe you?" "Because I'm a man with nothing to lose telling another man with everything to gain." Callum held the Marshal's gaze steadily. "You take this canyon by force, you'll lose men, maybe half your crew, maybe more. Women defending home with superior position don't die easy. But even if you win, what do you get? Land that's already claimed, paperwork fights, legal battles, years of complications." He paused, letting the math sink in. "Or you accept my offer. Walk away from a fight that'll cost you men and money. Find gold deposits that'll make you legend. Which sounds like better business?" The Marshal studied Callum with expression that calculated odds and outcomes. He was smart enough to recognize truth when he heard it. The canyon was defensible, the women were desperate, and even victory would come at cost that might not justify the gain. "How much gold are we talking?" "Enough to buy this entire territory twice over and still have fortune left to retire on." The Marshal lowered his revolver slightly. "You're either greatest liar I've ever met or you're telling truth. Either way, I admire the balls it took to walk in here." He holstered the weapon with decisive motion. "I'll consider your offer, but if you're lying, if there's no gold, I'll come back here and kill everyone in that canyon slow. Understood?" "Understood." "Then show me at dawn. If deposits are real, we'll discuss terms. If they're not—" He smiled without warmth. "Well, You won't live long enough to regret lying." Callum left the tent with pulse hammering and hands trembling from adrenaline delayed. He'd bought time. Maybe more than time. Maybe actual chance at peace. But only if he could deliver on impossible promise he'd just made. There was one problem. The gold deposits he'd mentioned? They were real. He'd seen them years ago while tracking horses through northern ranges. But they were also claimed. Defended. Operated by mining companies that wouldn't take kindly to interference. Which meant Callum needed to steal information about gold deposits from people who'd kill him for trying, present it to a marshal who'd kill him if he failed, and do it all by dawn. Just another impossible task in a series of impossible tasks that had somehow become his life. But as he slipped back through shadows toward the canyon, toward women sleeping fitfully before battle they expected at first light, Callum felt something unexpected bloom in his chest. Hope, desperate, fragile, barely alive hope. But hope nonetheless. And sometimes, hope was enough to build miracles on. Callum made it back to camp just as the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky. Women were already awake, positioned at defensive points, weapons ready. When he emerged from shadows, Kimala spun toward him with expression mixing relief and fury. "Where the hell were you?" "Buying us time." Callum moved past her toward the central fire where warriors had gathered. "How many of you know the northern ranges?" Confused looks answered him. "The territory's 3 days' ride north, mining country. Any of you been there?" Nasha stepped forward. "I have. Before the massacre, my family traded with miners. I know the routes, the camps, some of the operations." "Good." Callum's mind raced, assembling plan from fragments. "I need maps, anything you remember about gold deposits, active claims, locations that companies are working." "Why?" Kimala demanded. "What did you do?" "Made a deal with the marshal. Told him about gold deposits that make this canyon worthless by comparison. If I can prove they're real, he'll leave us alone." Silence crashed down like physical weight. Ayasha spoke first. "You made a deal with the man who came to kill us?" "I made a deal with a businessman who values profit over principle. Men like him don't care about land claims. They care about money. Show them better opportunity and they'll abandon worse one." "And if you can't prove the deposits?" Kimala's voice carried dangerous edge. "Then he'll come back and kill everyone slowly." His words, not mine. The women stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had, but insane plans were all that remained when conventional wisdom led only to death. "So we have until he returns to create intelligence about gold deposits that will convince him to abandon a fight he came prepared to win?" Kimala's tone held disbelief. "That's your miracle? That's our chance." Callum turned to Nasha. "Start mapping everything you remember. Locations, terrain, operational details. Make it detailed enough to be believable." "That could take days." "We have hours, maybe less." He looked around at faces that had become family. "I'm not asking you to trust this will work. I'm asking you to help me try while we still can." For a moment, no one moved. Then Nasha nodded and moved toward supplies where they kept materials for tanning leather. Materials that could serve as rough parchment. Takakota joined her, offering details she'd heard from travelers who'd passed through before the canyon became forbidden territory. Others contributed fragments of knowledge, trade routes, rumors of strikes, stories passed around evening fires about miners finding fortune in northern ranges. Piece by piece, they assembled intelligence that might save their lives or might get them all killed more certainly than facing the marshal's men in direct combat. As dawn broke fully and light flooded the canyon, Callum worked alongside women who'd taught him that family wasn't blood but choice, that home wasn't place but people, and that sometimes the greatest courage wasn't fighting impossible odds but finding new way around them entirely. 3 hours after sunrise, hoofbeats announced the marshal's return, but this time he rode alone, approaching the canyon entrance with white cloth tied to his rifle, universal signal for parley. Kimala and Callum met him at neutral ground while warriors maintained positions that could end negotiation with single arrow if terms went wrong. "Show me," the marshal said without preamble. Callum handed over the documents Nasha had created, maps marked with locations, detailed notes about terrain and access routes, information that looked professional because it was real. All of it real. Just not legally available for claiming because mining companies had been there first. The marshal studied the documents with practiced eye. He'd seen enough mining operations to recognize legitimate intelligence from fabrication. When he looked up, his expression had shifted from skepticism to hunger. "This is accurate?" "Every detail. I've seen the operations myself. Rode through that territory tracking horses years back." Callum kept his voice steady. "Deposits are substantial, but you'll need to move fast before word spreads. And you're just giving this away? For nothing? For this canyon? For these women? For chance at peace?" Callum held the marshal's gaze. "I came here with nothing and found everything. I'm willing to trade information for their safety." The marshal looked past Callum toward the canyon where women watched with weapons ready. He calculated odds one final time, weighing certain profit against uncertain battle. When he spoke, his voice carried decision. "Deal. We'll pursue the gold. You keep your canyon." He paused, studying Callum with something approaching respect. "But understand, this doesn't make us friends. You lied about the legal status of those claims. When mining companies find out we're moving in on their territory, blood will spill. That's on you." "I'll carry that weight," Callum said simply. "Same way I've carried everything else." The marshal nodded once, then turned his horse and rode back toward his camp. Within an hour, the entire force had packed up and moved out, heading north toward fortune that would almost certainly lead to violence with established mining operations. But that violence would happen far from the canyon, far from women and children who'd suffered enough. When the last rider disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving nothing but dust settling in morning light, the camp erupted in celebration. Women embraced, cried, laughed with relief that felt almost like disbelief. Children emerged from hiding to find their mothers smiling instead of preparing for death. Kimala approached Callum where he stood, watching the dust settle. Her expression mixed gratitude with concern. "You sent them toward claimed territory. You've started a war between the marshal's men and mining companies." "I've bought us time and peace," Callum replied. "What happens between armed men fighting over gold is consequence of their own greed, not our responsibility. That's cold logic from a man who just saved us all. That's survival logic from a man who learned it from you." He turned to face her fully. "You taught me that protecting family sometimes means making hard choices. That survival requires being willing to carry weight of necessary evils." Kimala studied him for a long moment, then smiled. Not the small, careful smiles of early days, but full, genuine expression of joy and relief, and something deeper he didn't dare name. "You've become one of us," she said simply, "in every way that matters." Around them, women gathered close. Ayasha placed her hand on Callum's shoulder. Nasha squeezed his arm. Takakota hugged him fiercely while her mother watched with approval. They surrounded him with acceptance that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. That night, the camp celebrated with songs that carried joy instead of grief, with fires burning bright instead of banked low for defense, with children playing freely instead of hiding in shadows. Callum sat among women who'd become family, holding Kimala's hand while watching stars emerge overhead, and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Peace. Not perfect peace. Survival never was. Not permanent peace. Threats would always find them eventually. But peace earned through courage and maintained through sacrifice. Peace built on foundation of people choosing each other repeatedly, despite every reason to choose isolation. As the celebration continued around him, as voices rose in harmony and firelight painted faces in warm glow, Callum understood the final truth his journey had taught him. Home wasn't place you found. It was people you protected. Family wasn't blood you inherited. It was choice you made daily to stand beside those who'd stand beside you. And love, real love, wasn't absence of loss. It was willingness to risk losing again because connection mattered more than safety. 3 years ago, Callum Thorne had been a man with nothing to lose. Tonight, he was a man with everything to protect. And that made all the difference. "Tell me something," Kimala said quietly, her voice cutting through celebration without interrupting it. "Did you know when you rode into this canyon that you'd end up here? That we'd become this to each other?" Callum considered the question seriously. "I knew I was riding toward my end. I just didn't know that end would become a beginning." She rested her head against his shoulder, and in that simple gesture was acceptance and trust and hope for future neither of them had believed possible. Around them, women who'd survived impossible odds continued their celebration. Children ran freely in space that had been prison, then refuge, then home. And somewhere in the distance, a marshal led his men toward gold deposits that might make them rich or might get them killed, but either way would keep them far from the canyon where women had learned to exist without fear. As the night deepened and stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, Callum made a promise to himself, to Kimala, to every woman and child in the canyon. He would protect this place, these people, this fragile piece they'd built from ashes of loss and violence, not because he was hero, not because he was savior, but because he was family, and family protected its own, always. If you made it this far, thank you for experiencing this journey with us. This story of loss transformed into hope, of isolation redeemed by connection, of broken people learning to hold tenderness in scarred hands. This is what makes storytelling matter. If you enjoyed Callum's tale, please subscribe to see more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us all what it means to be human. Drop a comment telling us what moment hit you hardest. And consider supporting us through Super Chat so we can continue bringing you stories that linger long after the final word. Until next time, remember, home isn't where you come from, it's where you choose to stay.